We have a great panel here, obviously, to my left, two of whom I've known for over a decade now almost, Karthik and Aakrit, and Anita. I have the privilege of meeting you in person today. But I'm looking forward to this conversation. We're going to structure today's conversation in three big buckets. The first bucket would be, what does AI really mean? Is the hype real? What is its impact on businesses, both large and small in India? Number one. Number two, we'll talk about its impact, the likely impact of AI on our society. Right? And the third bucket that we'll try and cover, time permitting, will be AI's impact on India as a nation, and also India's preparedness and competitiveness in the world of AI from a global standpoint, and also what specific fallouts or implications we see for India as a nation as AI develops rapidly over the coming years. So let me jump right into the first bucket, which is the business piece I was mentioning. So I'm going to start, Karthik, with you.
Sure.
You know, I think that over the last few months, many of you have heard the term thrown around. You've heard of ChatGPT, I'm sure. But there's still a little bit of, I would say, in Indian terms, gyan being thrown around AI without people necessarily understanding what it really refers to. So Karthik, given your work as an investor, obviously as someone who's invested in AI companies as well, maybe you can walk us through what does AI really mean, and what is its likely impact for startups, which I know is the world you inhabit more, to start us off.
Sure. Thanks, Anirudh. So I think, firstly, the idea that it suddenly becomes so mainstream in day-to-day conversations is actually what's new. I think much like even Indian infrastructural innovations like UPI, UID, etc., the work's been going on for 20, 30 years, right? And it's, I think, the compounding effect of what that means for what all lives it touches, what industries and what businesses it touches, is what's kicking into high gear today. And much like one fine day magically UPI came into effect, but it's actually 10 years of work before that. And so whether it's large language models, which has caught the attention of everybody, or whether it is medical applications in genetics, and whether it is industrial applications. By the way, one of our companies, which you know of, Grey Orange Robotics, it's 12 years old, runs entire warehouses autonomously, with about one person manning it at one corner. And H&M's largest warehouse in North America, which I went and witnessed, is run by machines. They actually move every shirt and skirt that is shipped out of that, right? So please note that that is not human operated. The machines have their own intelligence. So if a human went to actually find the shirt, they can't find it anymore. The machines have figured out how to place them in order of what demand is coming through the web interface, which is interconnected to the machine interface on the floor. So this level of complexity has been around. It's like you were running a mini city inside this warehouse with these 600 bots, which actually figure out how to move things on their own, right? So machine language data understanding has always been around. When it's come into the English language and you see it as accessible as typing using a prompt on a chat screen, it suddenly spooks you that it can be so smart. But there's, in my humble opinion, there's far more smartness in a lot more application areas already on the planet.
Right.
Right? In fact, I would say the margin of error in that warehouse is almost zero, whereas you see all sorts of gibberish on ChatGPT occasionally, because the models are not evolved enough, and it's far more subjective as opposed to objective. So this is, so you're itching to ask me a question, so follow on.
No, I have a couple, but finish.
So I thought you wanted...
I was going to ask you, I mean...
You wanted to double click on something.
For Grey Orange, right? So 10 years ago when you invested in it, it's a robotics company. It's positioned as a warehouse robotics company. So the question, if I'm in the audience, I'm thinking, is it that they were always an AI company? Or is it that recent developments in research, recent developments in LLMs have somehow changed the way they are functioning? Or is it just that you didn't call them AI earlier, so now you would?
It's an interesting point to touch. It's like worrying about how microprocessors change compute in over 30 years, right? So I don't know if you realize this, not now, I remember the data from 5 years ago. Each of the phones in your pocket was more powerful than the biggest mainframe computers in 98, right? So there is the speed at which you're developing that should also scare you at one level, right? And so that phone would have taken, quarter of this room to fit 20 years ago. So every innovation is compounding at that speed, and we find that we're uniquely sort of, grappling with AI, but it's been happening. So to your point, they started because they were hardware engineers and thought robotics was around hardware. Within 5 years, like you rightly said, they discovered that there's nothing, the actual hardware is commoditized. Everything else is in the intelligence of that bot being able to navigate things around. So I think for the first time, we're beginning to see people who have put in 10 years of work on large language models. I was just looking at this data point because it was vaguely in my memory. Google bought a company called DeepMind in 2014 for $400 million, which was 40 PhDs in the UK. That's it. There was no product. There was no technology. There was nothing to sell. There was no revenues. But the kind of work they were doing on language learning models was so superior to everything else in the world. So I think the foundations have been built for a long time, and what you're now seeing is an eruption of those in terms of various applications. So I didn't answer the key question. What does it mean for startups? I think in India, so I don't know if a lot of you caught this, Rajan Anandan of Sequoia asked Sam Altman when he was visiting here, who's the CEO of OpenAI, on whether he thought we can build AI models and infrastructure frugally in the Indian way that we build everything frugally. And he said, absolutely not, right, on stage. And he said, I don't think it's possible. You can give up trying, right? And on the other hand, the Americans, the Chinese are developing very sophisticated, large infrastructure sort of approaches to AI. I don't think India can afford to be left behind. On the other hand, I don't think we can throw billions of dollars and try to replicate that. Can we build unique sort of advantages from the Indian context around Indian languages, for example? Yeah, potentially. Indian applications, potentially, because these are not relatable to these developed markets. And lastly, I think language learning models are very inefficient when you try to apply the base generic set to a very focused industry application. So they will fail, and Aakrit will tell you more about that. And so you got to train them like everything else in life. It's like me saying we're a professor of English literature, and now I can go write a tech journal. You can't.
Or it's putting a corporate honcho as the CEO of a startup.
Yeah. Right. So these skills are different, and it's no different for language models. So I think there we have a little bit of an advantage because of our software chops and a large base. And I think we have an option to win there. But it'll have to be specific use cases in industry.
Yeah. So I'll come back to what it'll take for India and Indian startups and Indian businesses to win in this, maybe in the third section, a little bit more. But let me ask you before I move to Aakrit, is the hype real, according to you? Just yes or no?
I think it's real because you're forced to reskill and think of what the impact on labor that can skill to it is and labor that it will displace. So you can't just ignore the fact that people's lives will change even at the labor level, at the user level, and at what technologies are built to be able to take that advantage of that, right? You can't sit there and say, I'm a Luddite, I'm not going to adopt this.
Yeah.
You might as well start thinking about how to adopt it. And I spoke to a partner at Bain, and I was saying, how real is this at what you're seeing? He says, like 15% of all tech budgets will move to AI in this year, right? Globally, in big enterprise. So whether something comes out of it or not, I don't know, but the dollars are going to be spent trying.
Yeah.
So it's real in that sense.
Aakrit, let me pull you in. Like from what I know of Haptik, and obviously all the work you've been doing over the last several years around chatbots, etc. What's your sense? Is the hype around AI real? And what's your sense of what will be the key applications of it in the Indian business context?
Yeah. Hi. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for having us over here. I just want to take a quick segue to what Karthik mentioned that, how this is sort of work that's been happening for 10 or 15 years. Karthik said something offhand when we were just chatting before, which is, the idea of scale, right? For, let's say, a company like Haptik. We don't talk about it much. That's because it's not cool too. But let me ask you a question. What do you think? How many AI-powered interactions did the Haptik platform power in July? If you had to take a guess.
1 trillion?
No. I hope so. That would have, then I would be...
Anchored high.
Yeah, you really went high. But 1 billion.
The billion.
Right? So Haptik platform powered 1 billion AI-driven interactions in the month of July through our chatbots. And of course, sorry.
And I'll add, since you don't want to necessarily praise your own startup, yourself, I will mention that, many of the folks who I know in government have worked with Haptik to create several chat-based applications, even during COVID, if I'm not wrong. There were a lot of these information helplines that went from being call helplines to chat-enabled helplines during COVID.
Yeah, no, thanks.
Right? So there's a lot of interesting use cases, not just the numbers, but I think you've obviously through Haptik worked on various applications. But I'm going to ask you to move to the broader thing. Are you seeing that the kind of work that you've been doing with Haptik and chatbots over the years, are you seeing that really scale up across the board?
Yeah, so, and at 1 billion, right, we are definitely not the largest. Right? We are, I think in my guess, if you look at independent platforms outside of Amazon, Google, we're probably amongst the top 20 or 30 in the world. But there have been platforms that have been doing billions and billions of interactions a month for many, many years. So I just want to touch upon what Karthik was saying, that, what actually happened in November was the first time there was a consumerish application that was launched that became very popular. And the moment every one of us saw experiencing ChatGPT, that was the aha moment where it just spread like wildfire and everybody suddenly realized what's the power of AI. Now to answer your question, is the hype real? I forget 15, 30, 50. I actually think, and forget about the fact that I work in this space, it's 150% real. I think that the kind of products and the kind of change we're going to see within businesses, startups, enterprise is going to be mind-blowing. We've been working with OpenAI in some capacity since the start of 2022. So we've been working with the folks at OpenAI on some of these technologies for 18 months. And we've been messing around with all the GPT versions, GPT 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, all of those. And what we get to see day to day in terms of how fast the technology is developing, I think we're going to see applications that, we can't even imagine today. And in general, at least my personal view is these are all going to be net positive. Yes, there is going to be hurdles. Yes, there is a lot of stuff we have to think about in terms of privacy and data. But generally, at least my belief is these will be net positive longer term. And so what was the part B of your question? Is it real or not? And second?
What are some of the good check on whether I remember my own question?
Yes.
The second part was what kind of applications are you seeing? I mean,
Yes.
you've started to talk about a little bit of it.
Yeah.
What kind of applications are you seeing in the business context in India?
So, last week, I actually had a very long chat with an ex-professor at MIT whose student is the CTO of OpenAI. And I had a long chat with them about, and I had my own version of a fireside chat, which was asking him all the questions. And one of the questions even I asked was, hey, listen, what are the applications that you are seeing? And I think he summarized it really well. He said that, look, broadly, there are two big use cases that he sees is going to be the first wave of AI. First is going to be anywhere where you need summarization. So fundamentally, wherever there is a large amount of data, text, input, numbers, math, anything, and you need that to be summarized for you quickly, that's going to be one big, large wave of applications we're going to see. So it could range from, let's say in my business, a customer support agent getting a full summary of an entire conversation to, let's say, you getting an entire summary of a large Excel workbook, to in the manufacturing setup, you getting all the data offhand in terms of what happened yesterday. But summarization as like one theme is what we'll see as one large application. And the second is his take was, which I completely agree in what we're seeing, that the world of marketing and creativity is going to be disrupted. The idea of writing copy every single time in whichever shape and form, right? So whether it's, brand copy, ad copy, writing, creative, marketing campaigns, logos. I mean, he told me something that how startups are spinning out logos in like an hour now, right? Versus, back in the day, even when we were starting out, you had to like go to an agency, pay them, figure out a bunch of things. So I think that entire stream or wherever there is a creativity and marketing required is going to be disrupted. So these were the two things. And I loved what he said in particularly was, he's like, I think of ChatGPT as the best intern I've ever had. Or generative AI is the best intern I've ever had, where you can basically go tell this model, a language model.
If I may, right now, and I want to come to the audience in a quick second, I want to do a quick poll. See, now we are saying a very different thing. We are saying we have the best intern now. That to me is not that transformative. See, today people are talking about AI in the same breath as electricity, the steam engine, right? And in my book also, one of the things I wrote is that you go back, there are certain great games or great eras in the past where either certain key technologies or shapers completely transformed, not intern, not the best intern. That's, I mean, that kind of technology and waves of that kinds of technologies come every 10, 20 years, or if not 5, right? So I'm going to ask the audience, how many of you think the AI hype is real? Just by a raise of hands. Hype is real. How many think it's not? That is just hype made by Silicon Valley and ChatGPT and OpenAI. 3 or 4 of you. 6 of you. Great. No, I will say this, right? I think that while I believe in the transformative power of AI, and I do think that its potential, as I think as Karthik you're also saying, goes beyond that in turn. There's industrial applications, healthcare applications, tons of applications that we don't even anticipate today. I think it's we have to be very careful in sometimes taking, these waves that seem to erupt from Silicon Valley and being a little bit critical about whether they are as transformative as electricity and the steam engine.
I will pause 1 second here. So 2 things. First, an intern today, right, in terms of where it stands. Second, unlike crypto, unlike anything else, again, back to Karthik's point, this has been in development for like 15, 20 years. So it's not, the big difference, even when I try to ration it for myself, is it's not just, somebody released a paper and put a currency out and overnight it exploded. A bunch of people have been working on this for a long, long time. And that's today's just coming together of that.
Sure, I'm going to keep challenging on the audience's behalf. Lots of research happening in genetic technology, lots of research happening in biotechnology, right? But we're not talking about, Jennifer Doudna winning the 2020 piece saying that here, genetics can be edited very easily now using CRISPR technology. Why is AI that hyped up and let's say, something that took 30 years for them to also figure out in genetic technology?
The ability to speed in and personalize certain things is just dramatically accentuated by this technology. So whether it's personalized medicine, being able to customize to your particular genetic code. Similarly, when it comes to what you do with, and you're talking about not being radical, maybe it's not for a country like ours, which has a very small segment which talks to Alexa and Siri, but it's very, very common in the US to actually have that as almost like a, not an intern, but almost like a psychological help, right? You're almost talking to another sentient thing in your universe when you don't have enough people around you. So these are peripheral, but I now start thinking of applying them to areas where the cost was prohibitive historically to apply tech with a whole bunch of programming and people. It just crashes the cost of being able to imagine new solutions.
Yeah.
And therefore, productivity, ability to use people for better things, personalize all of the solutions, whether it is, it's not about language design, creativity, those are fine, but can you get 2 levels deeper, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the possibilities that you would never seen before. I mean, if you have to be idealistic about it, can we clear our legal backlog in the next 5 years, right? So I think machines can do a better job than all the humans put together because of capacity issues, right? And the same thing, we are not asking them to make judgments on behalf of the judges, but basically can you accelerate that summarization to a point where you can make these decisions.
Correct.
So I think the time has come to leverage these to accelerate all of those, is my take.
Yeah. So before I wrap up this part, and then I want to bring Anita in also, I will say that the other argument that's being made that goes counter to the point I was asking about is that AI, and I think Karthik, you both are referring to this, is that AI, unlike, let's say, genetic technology, right, in which also advances have been made over the last 20 years, is actually AI is considered to be a general purpose technology that will find its applications across sectors, right? Whereas genetic technology might not, right? It might be limited to a certain sector. Anita, I want to bring you in, which is a very big question. Now, we've been debating over the last 10 minutes on whether the AI hype is real, what it'll mean for businesses and startups, etc., what kind of applications we'll find. But I think, as both the panelists before you have said, there's already a lot of development that's already happened over the last decade, right? And as we think about any major technology over the last few centuries, each of these technologies that become that big, whether it's the steam engine, electricity, the internet, semiconductors, electronics, what you realize is that the shaping of that technology is never apolitical. It comes with certain values often embedded by the makers of those technologies, right? And I know you've done a lot of work in this, and the organization you've co-founded has done a lot of work in this. Talk to us about how are you seeing the development of AI being shaped by the values of its developers and researchers so far, and where are you seeing that permeate, and where are you seeing, how will it determine the future path of AI? Like the fact that these values that the tech developers, AI tech developers tend to permeate, whether consciously or subconsciously.
Thanks so much. We are in the business of watching Big Brother and Big Tech as an organization. And quite like this panel, I often think that we kind of front load the optimistic stories of technology and then say, well, can we think a little bit about what is shaping things? Which is, I think, quite natural because it's quite heady, right? I mean, technology is heady in and of itself. And the way in which we are so surrounded, we are so enmeshed, and often completely and involuntarily embedded in it has become the norm, right? So much before ChatGPT, of course, we were living within AI, even as we were ordering things on Amazon or booking a cab through Ola, right? Because the city functions on the kind of data that is collected by these transportation ride-hailing apps. And your destiny of whether you will get a cab or not and what time you will reach is determined by the supply of cabs, which is in turn determined by the platform and the AI that it runs, right? It's not rocket science, it's just that app. And for instance, in my city, Namma Yatri, is supposed to be a public alternative to Uber or Ola. And everyone recognizes that it's the economics of it rather than just the technology of it. So at some level, the publicness of the technology is never allowed to be expressed or manifest because the powers that be are so powerful. I want to say one more thing, which is that regardless of this hype around large language models, there is foundational AI. What is foundational AI? Foundational AI is basically this idea of building a predictive model. And for instance, we went to the Mandi about 4 years ago to look at how grain quality is determined, right? So in those days, the brokers, the middlemen would go to the village, bring a sack of grains, and then take it in their palm and look at it and say, well, this will go at so much rupees per quintal. But today, because of investments in looking at each image of a high quality basmati rice versus something else, machines are able to predict the quality and then the price in the wholesale market of that rice. So these foundational AI models are equally game changing, and often they are really the game changers with respect to the productive capabilities of an economy. So, for instance, if you want to do research on health-seeking behavior, how would you actually, or you want to actually look at how medical intervention can be done for malaria or tuberculosis, you will have to look at loads and loads of samples, bacterial samples, and then be able to invest in it. So, I think one thing that the a large language model, ChatGPT, Hype has done is it has displaced the debate at some level, and the attention that we need to be giving through public investments to foundational AI models is really not talked about. And I think that's very important for a developing country like ours. The second, I think, is a few years ago, my colleagues and I were here at the port, Bombay port. We were trying to look at how ports were getting automated. And, we met a lot of laborers, and, it's a high security zone. You need a special permission to enter the port. And one of the things was that we learned, and this is of course common knowledge now, that just before Christmas, just before Diwali, container ships, Amazon's container ships are waiting a few nautical miles from the port city of Bombay, because it's possible for businesses to exactly tell you what you must stock, right? How many units will be sold, and that was because of the magic of AI. So container ships are just waiting to promote that kind of consumerism on the one hand. And just ironically speaking, the matadis, the casual laborers, were quite unhappy. They came and told us, you know what? These days, these babus, they go to Singapore and they say on average, the worker there offloads so many containers, and I will get my wage if I offload that many containers. Where is this average coming from? It's coming from AI. What's an idealized labor? How many units you have to offload per day? That data is coming from AI. So in some strange way, I think, can machines do it better is a question we have to keep asking, because machines indeed do it better, but do they get it right all the time? There is an interesting concept all of us know here. It's called hallucination. Machines hallucinate. Because if you go through, we do this all the time in a training workshop. You put out a poem written by a poet, and you put out a poem written by AI. And then you ask the crowd, identify the right poem. Identify the human poem. It's very hard, because sometimes it's terrifying, because it looks like the machine's poem is more poetry than the human poem, right? So at some level, the error is in that one exclusion, one act of discrimination, one act of bias that can be life-changing for that one person, right? So I think on scale, we really have to also look at, and it's not to say that we have to be Luddites. More and more, I think, at the human automated system interface, we really have to pay attention. If you all know, for instance, Meta employs a lot of people to look at bad speech, unreasonable speech online, which at the first level is stopped by AI, right? It shortlists all the bad speech, and then human beings come in. But often they may not be well trained. They may not be trained to look at what's anti-caste, what is racist. They may not be trained. So very often I think it's really important as a society that we understand that we are very, very intermeshed in this AI paradigm and respond to it. And I also think that the prediction models carry a big risk, because who is investing in Fitbits? The companies that are investing in Fitbits, the largest amount of money that comes into the wellness industry comes from insurance companies. And that's because people really want to know that incentivizing the datafication of bodies is a route to make money, right? So the more information you have, you're not actually getting a democratic and happy society. The more information you have and the more data there is, the more predictions there are, you're condemning certain people to certain forms of future, exactly like the Matadi in the port city said, I cannot offload so much because the Singaporean worker is vastly better fed than me, right? My nutrition levels are far lower. And so I want to say that the worst thing that's happening perhaps is in the lives of children, and we really have to be cautious, because prediction models in class 4 are telling certain girls, well, you will never be a scientist. At the rate at which you're going, and forget the fact that the nutritional level of that child is so low that the cognitive capacities of that child have not really matured. So I think that we are really faced with a society with innumerable quandaries, ethical quandaries, where technology is certainly part of the puzzle, and technology is very vital. For instance, synthetic biology. We would never be here And I heard this beautiful story of Muslin from Dhaka in Bangladesh. Just because one person decided to be the messiah, and she was somebody in the UK who discovered this and went back to the digital sequence information and went to the plains of Bangladesh near the rivers and found that one seed and replicated it through synthetic biology and brought back that muslin after 40 years that it was not there. So in some sense, I think, there's a recent question, right? Will AI, pave the way for breakthroughs in medicine? Because AI is writing various equations. So people are really thinking drug discovery is going to happen because AI is writing equations. But of course, AI also hallucinates.
No, so I think that, thanks for, really laying out all the possible, risks, but also considerations that we have to keep in mind as a society as we think about the development of AI and its applications, and often how we import certain, as you were referring to in the Singapore example, certain metrics or certain biases that might be inbuilt in some of these AI models or AI prediction programs, which might not apply as much to the Indian context. Yet, it's a very interesting piece. I don't know how many of you have seen this, but in 2017 or 18, when the hype around AI was starting to build up, right? It's been many years in the making, but in 2018, Niti Aayog came up with India's AI strategy paper. Now, if any of you have read it, I have. If any of you have read it, you'll find that, Anita, actually the paper comes from a very society-first standpoint, right? The logo or the hashtag associated with this paper was hashtag AI for all, right? AI for all. And if you read through that paper, it was very clear that the thinkers behind this report or this strategy paper that was put out for discussion wanted AI to be leveraged for the key societal problems that India is facing, namely healthcare, agriculture, education, and so on. Now, the examples that the both of you had brought out when we were talking about AI's impact on business and competitiveness were, yes, related to healthcare, there'll be applications in education, etc., but it was not from a very societal standpoint. It was from a competitive standpoint, right? Karthik, you started talking about what India needs to win in this. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for India to possibly get on this wave, etc. And there is a possible sort of contradiction here, right? But I want to tease that out. So is there a contradiction between going with this AI for all strategy and finding applications in the societally, so the sectors that India needs most innovation in to solve its societal problems, and this other picture that seems to be operating with the US, China, you hear Google and ChatGPT and Chinese big tech firms all racing ahead of each other to find that next big LLM or that next big application, right? Is there a dichotomy here, or do you, in the Indian case, or do you feel like these two could be bridged, that we could do what the Niti Aayog paper says, AI for all, and what Anita has very forcefully argued, and yet compete in ways that we don't get left behind again as Indian entrepreneurs, Indian business leaders?
I think that the sort of the power of these new technologies actually accelerates the possibility of AI for all, if you ask me. So while I used an example of an Indian company solving American problems, because economically it's more fulfilling, right, for them and for us as investors, it doesn't mean that we have not backed companies which are solving in India. Aakrit, of course, is solving in India, primarily because there are volumes which have to be serviced at a low cost, which is enabling in some sense, using chatbots, right? If you had to replace that with human labor, first, I think it's an inefficient use of labor, if I may put it bluntly. Yes, we are job seeking as a country, we can do with millions more jobs, but you don't need to be call center executives who are underpaid or can't elevate their abilities to learn better used elsewhere. You can train them elsewhere. So if you look at Tricog in our portfolio, for example, which reads ECGs, today they've reached, their algorithms can predict a possibility of a stroke, like at 87-90% accuracy. All the data comes from emerging markets. So they're solving a problem at a price point that GE is like happy to sponsor because they can't do it in India. Neither has that kind of data ever been collected from the field, right? So I think if you think that you want to solve for emerging markets as a whole, there are a lot of opportunities. We have an agri-tech company which figures out how to crop spray better and not destroy the quality of the soil because it's applying computer vision to weeds, right? And it's in our portfolio. I'm not hallucinating, right? So I'm saying this is real.
You're not a machine as far as...
No, I'm not a machine. So I'm basically saying that these are possibilities. They look very virgin as opportunity sets. But think about this. Just that computer vision enabled bot sprayer was impossible to produce at Indian costs 7-8 years ago. Couldn't have serviced the emerging world, right? If you go to the US, that same bot built with like much lesser, ironically, I know the consul general is here, but ironically with bizarrely high costing, costs about 6 to 10 times more. I don't know why, what components they're using or why you need that kind of rocket science on a field, but basically we're able to deliver that at 1/10 the cost. So I think we talk a lot about language models, but these applications of AI have been there in data and computer vision for a very long time. The grains example was a computer vision problem. Had nothing to do with language, right? So I think when you start applying, and so imagine how sophisticated they get to be able to solve every problem at a very different cost. So without mobile telephony and data, India wouldn't be where it was today. And I'll put it bluntly, we would have got screwed in the pandemic if we did not have Geo, we did not have UPI, all in place, right? You would have had 800 million people on a voice telephony thing, and so we solved, right? We solved at a price point which was impressive for this country.
So if I can summarize that in the absence of AI doing that summarization, you're basically saying that there isn't that dichotomy. We could possibly solve for Indian problems at competitive price points and also be globally
which the Americans can never do at our price points.
And almost, I mean, the answer to your question, I in fact feel like my answer to that question is why even the question? In fact, AI is probably the first technology that's built as India for all. So my company, Haptik, was acquired by Reliance Jio a few years back. So one of the other hats I play is looking at AI initiatives across Jio. For the last 8 years, the only AI initiatives that have been going on at Jio are actually in agri and education. So, in fact, and there's a bunch of other examples of companies. So, I think it's actually the opposite of the dichotomy. I actually think that, and I've read the paper as well, right? I actually think that AI for India is going to be AI for all, and that is where the economic benefits will come from. I, in fact, think that building a customer support automation chatbot actually, potentially it's such a commoditized approach that anybody in the US, anybody in China may do it better, and we'll all be competing for the same dollars versus agri or education or space. These are problems unique to India where a large amount of value will get created. So I think it's the same thing.
Sure. So now let me move to a slightly related point, which is as these technologies emerge and as their transformative impact becomes evident to everyone, including policymakers, there's often an urge to regulate, and especially regulate the unknown. Right? I think many of us here who've been in the tech startup world at least I can quote this example. When drones started becoming big almost 8, 9, 10 years ago, right? The first urge that policymakers had was from a national security point, let's regulate the use of drones, let's ban it. And then years later, we've come to a point where we've said, no, there's a massive economic opportunity here, massive optimization that can be done, startups can use it, etc. Post facto. Right? But the initial view was very regulation heavy, was almost tech pessimist view, right? Are you all worried that in AI, we might again yet see a heavy regulation push before it should be there?
Like GST, you mean?
I will not comment on GST. But
Imagine if all LLMs have reverse charge mechanism GST.
no, but I want to quickly get the view on this. Are we worried that regulation could hamper innovation here? Or are we, whatever early signs of regulation and talk around regulation of AI, are we not worried yet?
I think there are too many murky areas not to think about regulation, right? So I think there's, so there are various facets I've heard, and various inputs I've got. But things like, something as basic as transparency. Is this AI generated or not, right? If you're actually publishing news on a website and you don't disclose that, that in itself could be borderline unethical, right? How is this generated? So today it's all mythical. Some machine spits out this poem for you. But is there a way to actually understand that, and will ChatGPT disclose that in the future? So I think when it comes to media, social media, I think you need to build accountability, even ahead of time potentially. Whereas it's not as relevant, let's say, in the computer vision models that we are speaking of for a certain application. On the other hand, with no offense to any Chinese in the room, the Chinese government controls most of the AI. Forget about regulating it. They have a view on who can have it, right? And so if you look at the fact that you can get caught in 8 minutes in China by the shape of your face or how you look, is how much power state can have over what AI models they allow and they allow you to adopt, right? And so there's these two extremes. And then there's the US, which is very liberal right now, which is not really touching anything. US approach, from what one professor of business school, we both went to the same business school, by the way, but I was in one of those free classes which they do for continuing education. He said the beauty of the US model is that they actually allow for new technology to find its balance and let it regulation free until there's incidents.
That's right.
Which is scary at one level.
But it has worked economically for them.
Autonomous
really
cars kill people, right? And both drivers and people standing on the sidewalk. And then they figure out how much regulation to impose. So as a result, it's the most innovative economy in the world at one level. Can we afford that in India? Maybe in certain areas we can, but in things like what can generate hate speech, or whether there's ethnic biases creeping into AI-generated nonsensical stuff which is spewing across social media, super dangerous, if you ask me. So I think there's things that can already destabilize, how every country or continent or market works. You need to impose, I think, tighter tabs upfront, in my humble view.
Upfront.
And it's not universal, the question
you
that
being
you asked.
you being government and upfront.
Yeah, I mean government and upfront. Government, hopefully with, ideological and technology and ethical inputs from all over the world. Because I don't think we are as isolated as we all think we are. And so there are enough inputs out there. So we took these views in crypto. We didn't allow it. It's not a bad thing. It's not like our country needs crypto for day-to-day survival, right? And so, there might be people who don't believe in government-issued currency, but chalta hai, the country runs, right? So it's not as critical. When AI, it can seep into the unknowns without you actually even beginning to know what happened, right? And so that danger, and drones, etc., are very different, Anirudh, because that's hardware. You can control hardware, right? I don't think you can equate an attempt at a drone policy to how AI seeps into our world, especially when it can penetrate basic common day-to-day existence for everybody.
Day-to-day applications.
Yeah,
no,
that's
right.
the worry.
That's right. And lastly, before we open it up, I think we're going to open it up in a couple of minutes, so please have your questions ready. Do not ask ChatGPT what questions to ask. I'm going to ask a question that has been, recently the Chief Economic Advisor for India wrote a piece on AI, and one of the dangers he highlighted from his standpoint was its impact on jobs in India. Right? And this is a question that's being discussed a lot. So I want to end with that question. It seems that the technology where it is today, and to your point earlier about summarizing and pieces like that, there's a lot of low to mid-tier jobs that seemingly will get replaced the first. Right? The ones where the value add maybe was not as much, and where summarization, logo design, things like that can easily be replaced, deliveries, etc. How worried are we that on the other hand, I mean, that was the CEA's point in his op-ed, that we really need to be mindful of its impact on jobs in India, given the job makeups we have in India. On the other hand, if you talk to any technological historian, people who studied various technologies over the centuries, those who are tech optimists of those historians will always tell you that, listen, this view that technology replaces jobs is mistaken. Technology always replaces some jobs, but creates many others. And net, they are job positive, right? So I want to get the panel's views quickly before we open. Is your sense, and how do we even start to think about whether the impact of AI in the Indian context will be net positive from a jobs and employment standpoint? Anita, maybe I can ask you to take this one.
Yeah. So obviously, I think this, when we talk about AI, we're talking about reorganization of labor at the level of the assimilation of the cognitive labor of human beings going into machines. So it's a completely different paradigm. And so we certainly can't look at any other prior industrial paradigm and say, well, you know, net, there's going to be a benefit. And of course, I'm not saying this, everybody's saying this. And the writing is on the wall. I think the issue about the jobs at lower segment going away is really true. But I think, just as you pointed out, in an interdependent world with the polarized AI powers, I think we really have a lot to worry about. And this is about productive capacity being hollowed out of certain countries because data from certain countries is flowing into two big powers, right? So we're talking about US and China. That certainly is going to call to question, what are we going to do, not just about jobs, but about our very basic production organization. I think that when knowledge doesn't exist and it's locked into enclosures of IP, it's going to be a serious problem. With ChatGPT, the latest debates are all about intellectual property. So you actually see the Chinese model is to respect that training data sets will not be opened up to IP, but Singapore, US, EU, everywhere else, the thing is, you know, let's actually open up the base training data sets and have public licenses. So what's really happening is a larger economic organization in which some countries will benefit and others will not, which really means that it's not just jobs, it's actually basic economic development. It's not just growth and prosperity, it's just basic survival. And certain countries also have the capacity, for instance, along with the World Economic Forum, people are reading the oceans. They're datafying the oceans in order to produce certain kinds of AI. So I think that we're talking really about a larger context. And your social media issue, I think I just wanted to say something to it, although it's not part of this round. I think we do need international kinds of, not just soft law, but something much more decisive.
Aakrit, anything on these jobs?
Yeah, I'll wrap up with like 2 quick points on both those earlier questions. As an entrepreneur, as an investor in early stage startups, AI is probably the first technology where I actually think regulation will drive innovation. So it's completely opposite to what you would think. Instead of fearing, I'm waiting for regulation to come. And the reason is, we have 330 corporate customers that we service across the world. Not one of them is ready to pick up our large language models today. Because all of them are worried about, where does this data go? What will my customers think? How does privacy work? What are you using underneath? Are you using OpenAI? Are you using Google? Are you using something else? Everybody is so worried because of the consumerization of ChatGPT that I'm waiting for regulation. You know, we all hate those accept cookie buttons on those websites. I'm waiting for something like that to come for AI. So that everybody around us in the world is a lot more comfortable with what this technology can do. Well, I would like to think that us and my engineers are all staying within bounds. I think we are. But that will also ensure that our competitors are staying within bounds. So that's my answer to that part. I wanted to add that, you know, I think regulation will be driving innovation even better because we'll have some rules. On the jobs part, you know, you said something, right, which basically all founders and entrepreneurs and investors love saying. Technology is always net positive, right? You know, some jobs will go, some jobs will get replaced. I've been saying this for 10 years. Whenever anybody asks me about AI, that, hey, listen, you make chatbots, call center agents, what about their jobs? I've literally been saying this for 10 years, except in the last 6 months, my view has changed. I do actually think there's going to be a period where we are going to have a loss which will to some degree impact India more than anybody else because of those two use cases I told you. Summarization, writing, design, all of those L1, L2 jobs, a large part of our country is employed in those. I mean, just look at the BPO industry, right? Like the ones that we also try to service. So I do think there is going to be a negative impact before there is eventual positive impact. And at least in the shorter term, we should be slightly concerned.
Great. I'm going to open it up for Q&A. I think there's a couple of mics floating around. So please raise your hands. I'll point you out. Please keep the questions brief, obviously. So I'll just come to you. We'll start with you.
I'm Mudit Jain, a businessman. I'm not a technologist. But if you ask me, AI would be best beneficial in India for governance. Why is that not happening? Because government is suffocating.
So why is AI not getting more adopted in
the government
and governance? Both government and the way it governs.
I'll take that because we do some work with the government. I was there last week actually in Delhi trying to talk about some of our things. I think the bigger concern over there is data privacy regulation.
Which, by the way, many of you will have seen today. India finally passed its data bill in the parliament.
So I think for governance-related use cases, they have a big concern that, you know, if I ask this thing, what is the tax code for something, will it go to the US? Will it go to China? Where does the data sit? How does it work? Who gets it? They don't even trust, you know, they don't, without rules, everybody's slightly worried, right? I think there's more rules, you know, it'll be a lot more comforting. But I think that's, for me, what I've seen as the short answer.
Hi, I'm Ravi Mariwala. I have a quick question is, you know, how is AI going to affect the human mind and the human nature? You know, if you look at something like Google Maps, which came in about 25 years ago, today we don't look at directions, you know, and this is personally I've experienced that. I used to love finding directions.
Correct.
I forgot in between and I said, oh, this is really terrible. I need to get back to it. How is it going to evolve? I mean, how is it going to affect the human mind and evolution and as a result, the society also?
I think that's an excellent question. Something I'm very passionate about. In my book, one of the things I wrote about was how the internet, right? And we'll come to the AI question, how the internet also has changed the way our mind has worked. We've gone from the folks who studied this from a psychology standpoint, professors, etc., about the internet. They have said that, you know, we are seeing that people are moving from a linear mindset to a networked mindset, right? Which is maybe academic speak for saying that we are no longer actually now thinking the way linear production processes were set during the Industrial Revolution. The internet, by virtue of you clicking and hopping and all of that, is actually now penetrating your mind's working, no matter whether you're using the internet or not. You're jumping off and often making links in your brain that earlier your linear process was not allowing you to. But with that context, let me ask the panelists what they think about that question.
So I firmly believe that AI is an empty signifier. What do I mean by that? I mean there can be AI that nudges, AI that does not nudge, AI that makes messages go viral, AI that does not make messages go viral. So in a society where misinformation is going viral, the question really is what kind of AI is making that happen? So I really think, similarly, if there is a society where there's no serendipity because Netflix is telling you, you must watch this because you watched that, then the question is, where is the serendipity? So AI, I think, is something that is to be shaped in certain ways, and quite like what you said, you know, if boundaries are drawn, and Shoshana Zuboff said this very famously, right? There should be certain places where you don't even collect data. You must allow society to be like that. It's of course contestable, but I do believe that we can't say AI will do this. You have to ask what kind of AI can create what kind of societies, for which you have to have a collective social vision of what kind of AI you want to create towards a certain society. I would, for one, certainly say that I don't want to live in a society of misinformation where AI is viralizing bad speech. So I think that it's quite a question of governance. It's not just regulation, it's a question of values.
It's a question of values, yeah.
My view is that, just to add to that, is that I think you need, in the case of AI, I think you need superior skills to be able to control the machines in some sense. It's not, for folks who are interested in engaging with it, is my point. Now, if you're trying to defend someone who wants to deliberately dumb down their life, I unfortunately don't have any sympathy for that. So, like the other day, there was a new Uber driver. He's a new employee in the city. He has no choice but to actually go by maps. So now we can have a debate about livelihood. Your version of maps would never have allowed him to come in and get livelihood. Whereas Google Maps plugged into Uber allows him to actually have livelihood in Bombay. So I'm just saying, the point is if he wants to learn, he can learn. But I think most people don't want to necessarily challenge themselves with mundane stuff, right? It might thrill you. I was a geography student. I'm exactly like you. I love what you said, but no, 90% of the people don't seem to care. So I think with it's like saying we've lost craft in the age of mass manufacturing. Of course we've lost it. But people who value craft will pay a premium, or art will pay a premium and buy it, right? So this NFT thing was a fad. It came and went.
To say Daniel Kahneman's term, we are just following type 1 thinking, no type 2 thinking.
That's right. But I think AI is making you have to, skill up, right, to add value. I think, and I love the point you've made about values because, see, ultimately, there's a value in economic efficiency and livelihood, and then there's a value in serendipity. We as a country, we as developers, we as entrepreneurs have to decide which values we want to shape. There's a great professor at MIT whose book has come out called Power and Progress, Darin Acemoglu. He's a Turkish professor at MIT. And he says that the choices that countries are going to make about which technologies, even in the world of AI, to adopt will depend on what values you want to actually adhere to. Do you want to replace, for example, labor? That's a value that might be very important for a country like Israel or a country like the US where maybe there's shortage of labor. Or let's say in the context of India, as we've been discussing about jobs, if for us productive employment for a massive piece of our population is an important value, then we have to make sure that the technologies we're developing and adopting here are less labor replacing, but more labor productivity enhancing. So WhatsApp, for example, is a technology application that one can argue has enhanced the productivity, not necessarily taken away too many jobs. But a lot of automation in, let's say, industry might take away jobs, but not enhance the productivity, right? So I think those are the kinds of value choices that will need to get made.
Hi, I'm Preeti. I just want to check that, the way we've moved from replacing currency and do most of our banking electronically, where do we see AI going into the financial markets or the banking system really from here after this?
Karthik, Aakrit, you want to take a crack at that?
I think most sort of AI technologies in these kind of applications are going to become the common phrase that's being used now is co-pilot. So they just enable you to be smarter. Like actually, I would think that a lot of people struggle to make investment choices without a great advisor. Not everyone's a born investor, but everyone should have an equal shot at making similarly good returns. And I would actually think AI will help you do that better because it's a very objective art. There's nothing emotional about making money, right? You want to make as much as the other person makes on whatever savings you have. But somebody had a distinct advantage over you because they either had some subjective better advisor or they had more money, even worse, they had more money. And therefore they outperformed the person who had 500 rupees to save versus 5 lakhs to save. That's just gotten neutralized by AI, if you ask me. So there's incredible power in being a co-pilot to all of your use cases. And, my driver, your driver can do as well as us on equity portfolios. How wonderful is that? So I feel that is the way to think of the potential of it. And I'm an idealist as much as I'm a tech investor. I feel those are the models that will win in the long term, especially in markets like ours.
The first and the greatest application of AI has been built in the banking industry and it's called the ATM. I genuinely believe, I use this example often, which is whenever we think about AI in different industries, we should always think about what happened with ATMs. And for 50, 100 years, the most common thing you would go inside a bank for is to take out money. You would wait in long lines. Tellers would be frustrated. Today, if you go to any bank branch inside, it's great. You don't have to wait that long. tellers are sophisticated. They've upskilled. They can handle much sophisticated queries. Why? Because most of the task of taking out cash is done outside through a machine. So I generally believe that the banking and financial services world adopts a lot of these technologies first. I think robo-advisory, like Karthik mentioned, which is the advisory piece of wealth, I think is going to be a big application. I think you'll start getting intelligent recommendations on accounting, savings, how can you move money around. But I think we're going to see some really innovative stuff.
Question there.
I'm Supriya, and I had a question about what you spoke about governance and data privacy, and that how corporates are not willing to take the plunge into the LLMs, and rightfully so. Why do we have to wait for governance for companies to take that jump? Because as entrepreneur yourself, if you were transparent and you were to let the corporates know how their data is being used and what are the firewalls in place, there would be more vast adoption of this technology. I'm an AI educator, and today I'm afraid of telling children, to use this, or even adults, because how do you trust the technology when you don't know where your data is going? And the second part of my question was that given that most of these large language models are being made in the Western worlds, they're biased because they're being trained on Western data, right? How do we neutralize that? What do we do as a country to make that more equitable?
So both great questions. So the first one is, in any society, whenever there is some sort of mass movement or application, you need someone to set the rules. It's like driving on the road, right? If there's no stoplights, people are not going to be sure, should I move forward? Should I stay? Should I go back? What if I move forward and somebody hits me? I think that's kind of what's happening in AI, which is, in fact, there's only so much as a for-profit business I can do because my incentives are aligned to make profit. So a corporate or a customer, as much as I might be the nicest person in the room, has reason to believe that I may not be dictating the rules. So I think there has to be some central body. We were a bunch of us where that question was alluded to. We were at the Sam Altman event in Delhi. And he said the same thing, which is he's waiting for some sort of a similar bill to come out, which sets the rules so that everybody feels a lot more comfortable. So
the devil here will really lie in the details.
Yeah.
There's one thing to say we want guardrails and traffic lights.
But who also set them?
And there's, we're sitting in Bombay, so I must say that there's the other part of that slippery slope, which is license Raj. Yes. Right? And there has to be a fine balance there. And that's what I think policymakers seem to be focused on, which is not to kill innovation and the entrepreneurship, yet set the guardrails that are required for people to trust the technology and its application.
I must definitely call out, we may have all polarizing opinions on governments, but I must definitely call this part out, where even right now, when they've been thinking about what an AI policy for India looks like, they're involving all of us.
Correct.
I've been in every one of those discussions. A lot of entrepreneurs elsewhere also have. The second question, which was...
no, wait.
Which was Western bias. There we go. All right.
Otherwise his job was about to get replaced.
Because that's an amazing question. I think not enough people are asking that particular question. And there is merit to it. Here's good news. There are at least 4 companies, startups, that I know that are trying to solve the problem of building India first LLMs. That's where Arjun's question to Sam was that can India first LLMs be built. There are now few attempts being made, a couple of them fairly well funded. So I hope to see some breakthrough in that.
I just wanted to answer a little bit of that, yeah. Just to offer a provocation. I think one of the assumptions on which we live in this data-fied AI world is that scale works. I think somewhere, so far, the benefits of this, initial innovations, the platform economy, all of that is owing to the network effects. But I think we are back to square one in examining whether we do need scale and we do need AI on scale for everything. I think we have to question that. And one of the things, for instance, my organization is doing is, along with one of the state governments, we are building a public AI for the government schools. And we are saying, this is not a prediction model. It's a diagnostic tool. The teachers are well placed to understand how to apply the diagnostics in a very contextual, accountable, transparent, and communitarian way in order not to seal the fate of a child that might actually have hidden talents, but is condemned as not an artist, not an engineer, not a doctor, but to actually use the AI and make human decisions in a particular context. So I think that the romance with scale is something that we really need to question. And that is when we will be able to shift focus and say, even your question about bias, right? Bias is happening because we think that models have to be global, homogeneous, and have some common denominator. They needn't. You can do something else with an entirely different set of values, which is why I think all the academic literature around this is, are you going through Shinto Buddhism, or are you going through Western liberalism, or are you going through American libertarianism? How are you building your AI, and what values are these? Yeah.
Great point. Great, excellent points, I think, all of them. So I think you have a question. You've been waiting very patiently. Can someone get a mic to sir? And if there are any folks in the back that I have not yet seen, please just raise your hand so I can tell. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Sudhakar Malpe. I have a question for Anita as well as to Karthik. We have now crossed population of China. And appears to be our youngest population is also very, very focused. Anita referred about the revolution of summarization and agriculture. This thing we were agriculture economy and surface transport is the one thing which is linking with what you referred as the port. We have port, but unutilized, not actually democratize this thing. I agree. But Karthik addressed it very well. So if you can, enlighten this August gathering with this, how AI or machine learning or deep learning, because in medical history, because now it has gone to the, to deep into, operation theaters. So how do we, revolutionize further? What Haptik said about the Niti Ayog's paper. Paper is there, but actual implementation is not taking place. The same. See the
question, if I may,
thank you.
The question is, how do you deepen further applications in healthcare or broadly?
Healthcare broadly, as well as the education. Most important is the surface transport.
No, I think broadly, going back to the cab example, or how, how sort of truck drivers' lives are being improved because you can build efficiencies that were not possible before, were just enabled by, GPS and mobile phones, right? So I'm not saying that AI will go and solve for a truck driver and auto driver. They do in some sense today. They make their lives more efficient and productive for the same amount of hourly output that they can do. And I think that is the trend line basically we're predicting, that a person who can up their skill to be able to take advantage of whatever this co-pilot, I keep using that word as a broad definition, but what is the co-pilot for each use case? So this farmer leverages information and technology which he never had before to be able to make his spraying more effective on that field, right? So you can say a machine could have done that, it can't. The farmer needs to be able to leverage that, right? So if you can now see the amplitude of that across the country, it can be game-changing, right? Soil quality can be better, hours can be spent better, that farmer can be sitting in, there's manual labor when the cotton crop is placed in this country, manual labor moves acre to acre for every 5 days as the monsoon moves to be able to weed the cotton flower. This is absurd labor if you ask me. That's not the kind of jobs you want to create also. So I'll be a little, controversial there and say that's not the kind of jobs you want to create. So I think there are better problems to solve, and you can train your sort of labor market for a very, very different AI-enabled world. Not overnight, but 5-10 years from today. I think it'll change the way we educate our kids in terms of what skills to give them. And it's inevitable, otherwise you'll be left behind is my harsh take. So I think that's the bigger thinking. That's the bigger worry always for me. Are we putting enough foundational learning into schools to be able to leverage technology? Are we putting them through the same rigmarole we learned 30 years ago and then leaving them under-equipped to be able to take advantage of what these new jobs could be. You can't go tell them to go back to the fields. Nobody wants to be in the fields. They're coming to the cities.
I'll take a couple of questions.
My name is Jamal. I'd like to pick up on what Ravi was asking. See, technology, as it takes over our lives, and clearly AI is going to take over our lives, we lose certain human abilities. Nobody can multiply anymore, right? Nobody remembers phone numbers because you don't need to, right? I'm not saying it's good or bad. My question is, what human abilities do you think we will lose as a result of AI, becoming part of our life?
Can we also get the mic to lady in the middle? We'll take a couple of these questions together.
Hi, my name is Beena Bhatia and I'm an educator. So I wanted to address it to the panel basically about value ethics and guidelines. Are we going to have cognitive being replaced by AI? Will they dictate, rather than the cognitive mind will dictate what values, what guidelines, etc. to be done? That is one. And then when Karthik and Anita did, and they addressed that Matari question, or that language learning and the digitization is very prominent in India, whereas he mentioned right in the beginning that H&M is completely logistically controlled by AI. So are we going to be ready to help educate, empower, and employ the people to use AI for agriculture or for whatever reason, like you said, in predicting in the health industry where insurance companies are happily dictating. So are we ready to form guidelines and also educate, empower, and then generate employment? And also, the last question is if India can be trained for manufacturing. I think that is one area where we lack completely in AI. So if we can employ something for manufacturing, we could rock the world, I think.
So cognitive abilities that will get replaced, and are we ready to educate and empower? Or
I'll take a shot to your question. Like really practically thinking, I actually think we'll start maybe losing our basic writing abilities. I think, yeah. So I feel like because there is so much communication that happens in text today, whether it's email or whether it's text messaging, I think a lot of that will be autocorrect, copilot, replaced.
But will literature get replaced?
No, that's why I said writing.
So right, like literature is also writing.
No, I said basic day to day, right?
Basic day to day writing, communication, like work communication, and
or even communicating with just on text messages, emails, all of that.
Boyfriend and girlfriend, husband and wife. That will also.
Yeah, or like when you want to, or like or like
which might work well.
Yeah, like for example, I'll give you an example of what happened last week at work. Right, our organization is so embedded with like everything. Like even people are so embedded with AI and ChatGPT. So, we had a weekly meeting with the finance team. Anyway, long story short, we had a fairly big receivables in our bills from July. So I really came down hard on my team saying, listen, what's going on? Let's drop everybody an email today, with this. Within 2 minutes, they send me a draft of the email they're going to send. I said, what happened? How did you send this in 2 minutes? We asked ChatGPT. We have the license, company-wide. So, just step by step, I think the basic, like these are all writing abilities I think we're going to lose, not literature. I think there's a difference. I think that's one thing I'm seeing happening.
Correct. These are cognitive functions that I think we will understand the implications of this later. Yeah. Any other thoughts on this cognitive function piece? Yeah,
I just wanted to say that I think we all tend to get nostalgic, but it's a little bit like my parents watched black and white films and then they thought color is not so good, and then there's animation, and then the world of AI powering films and AI writing scripts for films and what have you. So I think in the march of civilization, human cognition is not going to go away. I think I could have like a private conversation with you on this. I don't know. I think a lot more people, younger people are writing novellas and they're like publishing, and it doesn't quite matter that there's that autocorrect, but the cognition is still creating literature, right? So I quite agree with you that it's going to be different. Now, whether that difference means we used to be a better society, we don't know. And no, you were right. You were right that you asserted that you're asking a neutral question. I also wanted to take the other question about the educate, empower, and harms. Is it okay?
Yeah,
20
please.
seconds, yeah. I think one thing we should do better as a society and as a country is on public consultation. I think industry, of course, should be consulted, but I think civil society should be consulted, and we may not be experts, but public interest is very much residing in civil society. And exactly like The Social Dilemma, the film, the progeny of all those innovators are never allowed till age 16 to sign up to a social media account. Have you all watched that film? So somebody that's interviewed says, Mr. MZ will not let his child, actually sign up to an Instagram account. Why? Because that's the nature, you know exactly how it's running. What kind of, that's not just profit, right? It's extractivism. You're not just running, a business. You're just running something else. You're like hollowing out society. So at some level, I think that the publicness of, the education, empowering, etc. will happen, not just if on ag tech companies are consulted, but small farmers are consulted. So I think that way you can cascade that generalization for education, educators are consulted and not just that one singular monopoly company in our country, that's whose staff members are now going on strike, right? So I think we really need to invert the question, and therefore harms is another thing. It's not just privacy harms. I think second order harms, and I'm not talking about an existential threat where the planetary switch will be off and all of us will go into the abyss. I'm talking about harm as a societal construct. It's not my data is taken away, but what happens when insurance companies are running the country, right? And we see the medical system in the United States. Similarly for fintech, right? And financialization particularly. Saskia Sassen wrote this beautiful thesis that the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, 2009 in the US was because computers ran amok. That was the initial AI that wrote those extraordinary fractals because of which, lending just went above the head and people just became poor. And who got affected? Black women. Right? So we are talking about this thing that you sit and you say, "Arey yaar, machine chalao," then keep lending. And my friend's husband, who used to work with Citibank, just resigned because he couldn't go to bed each day carrying that guilt, right? So that's AI for you. So I think we really need to be careful.
And that raises a very interesting question. I think that I've heard in a couple of other AI-focused conversations I've been part of, which is, should we be scared of AI? And an interesting provocation I want to throw to the panel, and if any others have questions, please raise your hands. The provocation that I heard was a couple of AI researchers, very accomplished AI researchers who've been in the field for 40, 50 years said, actually, I'm not afraid of AI, I'm afraid of the humans who are training the AI, and that if you look into history again, and I keep harping on history because I think sometimes there's lots of interesting lessons there. They say actually that human tendencies, human frailties have not changed. No matter what technology has come about, human frailties, greed, not caring about the impact on the other. For example, right, what you're referring to, Anita, those frailties have not gone away. Those ills of the human mind and human condition have not gone away. So, should we be more scared of AI, as you're arguing here, in the case of the subprime mortgage, or the humans?
Me? Okay.
No, go ahead. You've said AI. We're going to get Karthik to answer whether he thinks...
It's like the famous Charlton Heston quote, right? Guns don't kill people, people kill people.
People kill.
Yeah, so I think
people kill people without guns.
Yeah, it's fundamentally going to be about which society chooses what value systems to govern this, right? If if the leaders in that society care about their people, they'll build a very different set of guardrails. If they don't, you're going to see things that serve their control of power, right? And if you don't have democratic systems which can challenge that, you might have a messed up sort of, interpretation of this or application of this in society. That is the harsh truth, right? And that's why the China, US, Europe approaches are all a little different.
Correct.
And I don't know where India will lie in this. I wish I knew.
People are arguing that the approach or the philosophical approach underlying UPI and Aadhaar might permeate into AI, the AI philosophy India has also, which is that of the data commons, consent-based data sharing, right? That a lot of the principles underlying UPI's architecture might permeate into how Indian regulators and policymakers, government at least thinks. Hopefully, and that presents a very different model, I think, as many have argued, compared to the EU regulation-heavy, US private sector-heavy, and Chinese state-heavy models. Aakrit, any thoughts on who to be more afraid of?
Oh, definitely people. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I think, and that's why, just back to the same thing. That's why, even as a business person for profit, I bat for regulation to come sooner than later, so that, like I said, we are fine-tuning models today. I would like to think that our data scientists, our engineers have the right intent and are serving the right purpose, and I think they are, and I can confidently say that. But I can't say that about my competitor. I can't say that about, a 2-person startup out of IIT Bombay who will have all the noble intentions, but maybe their risk-taking appetite is a lot more. Maybe their awareness about where these things go is a lot lesser, right? So I think only when there is some policy around it, and exactly, I think I concur with you that I think India is going to take maybe a similar stance to what has been happening with other technologies, which will be different from China, EU, and maybe the US.
I think we've reached time.
Paula,
this has been
one last question.
One last question. Can we take that? Yeah. Okay, perfect. Paula.
Okay. Great discussion. My question is a little bit different. It's on technology itself and all what's at the core of the technology. All these models are obviously machine learning. The data is coming from all over. Like you said, we have many companies here which are doing data tagging, which is a low-level work that we are contributing again to technology. And what was said, I think you referred to the Sam Altman conversation where he said it won't come from India. The basic core technology won't come from India. All these models, the predictive models, the diagnostic models, they are coming out of a couple of places in the world.
Correct.
And there is an accuracy issue and there's a bias issue, all of that. Will that ever displace and come to other parts of the world where actually new technologies, new algorithms, which is actually driving this, right? So that research is going to also drive some of the applications that we talked about, which are for India. Otherwise, we will not be able to. So do we ever see that shift, or is Sam Altman going to be right, that we will always be the back end and never be actually at the core?
Yeah, let me detail that out also for your consideration, for the panel's consideration. So there are 3 or 4 pieces that people talk about that will need to be figured out if the concentration of AI research coming out of the US and let's say China is to be diffused further into other countries. One is capital. I think as Sam said in that conversation, he said Indian startups, Indian venture, you just don't have billions of dollars to pour like we might do in Silicon Valley. So there's the capital question. The second very important question is that of research, right? The kind of quality research that's happening in certain countries is dependent on not just capital and funding of research, but also the talent. Right, so the question is, where is that talent? I think I saw an amazingly fascinating chart recently that said about maybe 20% of top AI researchers in the world are of Indian origin. But zero, almost zero, close to zero, are actually sitting in India. Right, so those researchers are doing their standard story of brain drain. And so the talent is not sitting here, the research is not happening here, the R&D dollars going into that research are not being given in India. And capital while we have an amazingly thriving VC ecosystem that many of us are part of, we are not at that scale. And then there's the final piece, which is where will applications get found, and then that can sometimes back into the research, right?
But all of that sums up as a capital problem, right? If you I'm saying talent, R&D to some degree. So the other day, I was talking to a peer founder in the Bay Area. So the number of people who know how to work on LLMs, and I'm not talking research, I'm talking engineers. Engineers, software engineers who know how to work LLMs are roughly about 800 to 900 in the world. About 50% of them sit within 50 miles in the San Francisco Bay Area. The average going rate for one of them, and this is about a 4 or 5, 6 year experienced engineer, the average going salary for somebody like that currently is about $1.5 million a year cash and about $2 million in stock. You know, when I was... Sorry?
Not cash.
Yes. $1.5 million in cost to company, CTC, and $1.5 million in ESOP. When I heard that, I said, can I get a job? Right? But in all seriousness, so, you know, when you, and same goes with research to some degree, right? Eventually, a lot of the research is also then solving problems for private sector. Talent is there. So all of this to some degree is a capital problem. And now what happens, right? Like, let's say if you look at investors or anybody else, I don't even think they're wrong. See, the problems that we have to solve over here in a developing country still are to some degree roti kapda makan. We still have, I mean, those are solved, but in the way of it, in the where AI stands, we're still solving developing country problems.
Healthcare, education, financial services.
Healthcare, education, financial services, agri, all of that.
All those.
Yeah, and you know, it's difficult today to say that, look, we're going to write a $100 million check.
I'll leave
I
want to
leave
leave the audience with a little bit of a note of optimism, right? So 2 days ago, 48 hours ago, there was an article in the New York Times citing the hotbed of space technology innovation as India.
As India.
Right? Now, if you had imagined that article 5 years ago, you would have said it's impossible.
Which goes against the capital point you're making, that
Correct,
there's
correct.
a frugal way of doing it.
We put stuff on Mars and the moon at a cost that nobody else on the planet can. Right? It took us 40, 50 years to develop alongside the Russians and the Americans and whoever. But the point is that we figured out frugal innovation with certain infrastructural elements being in place. So we don't have Cisco in this country, we don't have Nortel, we don't have Ericsson, etc. We shamelessly leverage that network infrastructure to build a phenomenal data network, which serves this country very well, right? We don't have to build every switch, every element of every router, every edge, but we can build a phenomenal telecom network. So I think we need to focus on our strengths and leverage those for our applications and still solve for these basics. Because you don't get 1.2 billion people, 1.3 billion people out of the basic needs. There's no greatness around where India will go on the back of the conversation we're having in the Taj. Right? Absolutely. So I'm saying this is a very elite conversation. How are you going to solve for 1.2, 1.3 billion people? So the fact that we have 140 space tech startups today in India and can be funded by, very frugal desi venture capital is a very telling sign of what can come in the future.
Correct.
So I think we need to focus on what application areas we can win on and just take that. I think there are enough prizes. I don't think there's a single prize.
Yeah, and
No. Me. Wait a minute.
Yes, sorry.
Anita.
So, with optimism comes caution. And I just wanted to add a word. And I think it's really important that we focus on capital, we focus on research. One thing I think the UPI example talks about is the balance between public investment, public standards, public goods, and where, private investment and, private models will be. But there's one elephant in the room, and that is called data sharing. Because the latest data protection bill, for instance, talks about blacklisting countries. The blacklist will disallow data from traveling cross-border. What it essentially means is in health, in agriculture, in many sectors, data will flow out. Now, I'm not an advocate of data localization or data being stored in servers outside. But without the resource of data, it is completely impossible to actually build the prowess to be able to develop your AI. So the current data protection bill in one of the op-eds that I've just written, which will hopefully be out in the next couple of days, is this elephant in the room of data sovereignty. And unless you have data sovereignty, which is the cautionary optimism, you just are not going to be able to reap the rewards of AI. And secondarily, the surface transport question is, why must all the data about my city be locked up with an Uber? It's public data. It was generated through society's footprints. And without the data sharing question, you will never ever be able to solve the AI economy question.
No, great. I think that's a great note of, I think, both caution and optimism here. I'm going to wrap up, but let me first say another source of optimism for me is, as elitist this conversation might have been, I think it's great that we're having this conversation, and thank you to Asia Society for hosting this, early in our wrangling with AI. If you look back 20, 30 years when the consumer internet phenomenon and the values it promoted, I don't think that we were having these kinds of conversations. And the conversation around attention deficit, etc., came much later. So I'm glad that these kinds of conversations are happening today, and that folks from, I think, various walks of life, various ages, various economic, I think, professions have come together here to discuss these, because I think the more we discuss these publicly, I think the more informed, hopefully, our decisions and value decisions as a country, hopefully, will be.